The Forge of the Conqueror. In the year 356 BC, in the royal palace of Pella, capital of Macedon, a storm raged over the mountains as Queen Olympias gave birth to a son. The night was filled with thunder and lightning, and the court whispered that the gods themselves were announcing the arrival of someone extraordinary. King Philip II stood outside the chamber, battle-scarred and ambitious, dreaming of uniting the fractured Greek city-states under Macedonian rule. When the infant's first cry echoed through the palace halls, Philip received news that his general had just won a crucial victory against the Illyrians. On that same day, his horse-tamer had successfully broken the most prized stallion in the kingdom. The oracles declared these simultaneous victories as divine signs. This child would be destined for greatness beyond measure. They named him Alexander. From his earliest years, Alexander was raised in a world of power, violence, and ambition. His mother Olympias was a fierce woman from Epirus, devoted to the mysterious cult of Dionysus and convinced her son was descended from the gods. She whispered to young Alexander that he was no ordinary child, that the blood of Achilles flowed through his veins on her side and Heracles on his father's. Philip, meanwhile, was transforming Macedon from a backwater kingdom into a military powerhouse. He created the legendary Macedonian phalanx, a revolutionary infantry formation that would change warfare forever. Alexander watched his father's campaigns from childhood, absorbing lessons in strategy, diplomacy, and the brutal realities of power. But the relationship between father and son was complicated, marked by both admiration and rivalry. You are watching Iconic Figures. Stay with us until the end to discover how this story shaped history. When Alexander was 10 years old, a horse trader brought a magnificent black stallion named Bucephalus to the Macedonian court. The horse was wild, untamable, and had thrown every rider who attempted to mount him. Philip ordered the horse taken away, deeming him worthless. But young Alexander noticed something the adults had missed. The horse was afraid of his own shadow. "Father, what a horse they are losing because they don't know how to handle him," Alexander declared. Philip laughed at his son's boldness and made a wager. If Alexander could tame the horse, it would be his. If he failed, he would pay for it himself. The boy approached Bucephalus calmly, turned him toward the sun so the shadow fell behind, and spoke soothingly to the animal. Within moments, Alexander mounted the stallion and rode him across the field in perfect harmony. Philip watched with tears in his eyes and reportedly said, "My son, seek a kingdom worthy of yourself, for Macedon is too small for you." Bucephalus would remain Alexander's companion for the next 20 years, through every battle and conquest. Recognizing his son's exceptional nature, Philip hired the greatest mind in Greece to be Alexander's tutor, the philosopher Aristotle. At age 13, Alexander and a select group of noble youths traveled to the Temple of the Nymphs at Mysa, where Aristotle established his school. For 3 years, the future conqueror studied philosophy, medicine, logic, and literature under the master's guidance. Aristotle gave Alexander a personal annotated copy of Homer's Iliad, which the young prince kept with him always, even sleeping with it under his pillow alongside a dagger. The epic tales of Achilles became Alexander's obsession, his blueprint for heroic destiny. He memorized entire passages and dreamed of achieving glory that would echo through eternity. Aristotle taught him that the pursuit of excellence, of arete, was the highest calling of man. But while Alexander absorbed Greek culture and philosophy, he never forgot he was Macedonian, a warrior first and foremost. At 16, Philip left Alexander as regent of Macedon while he campaigned in Byzantium. During this time, a Thracian tribe called the Maedi revolted against Macedonian rule. Alexander didn't hesitate. He gathered troops, marched against the rebels, defeated them decisively, and established a new city called Alexandropolis. It was his first military victory, and his first city bearing his name, but it would not be his last. 2 years later, at the Battle of Cheronea in 338 BC, Alexander commanded the Macedonian cavalry at just 18 years old. He led the decisive charge that shattered the elite Theban sacred band, ending Greek resistance to Macedonian power. Philip had finally achieved his dream. Greece was united under Macedonian hegemony. But the victory celebration would be short-lived, as the relationship between father and son began to fracture. Philip took a new wife, a young Macedonian noblewoman named Cleopatra Eurydice, displacing Olympias in his affections. At the wedding feast, Cleopatra's uncle drunkenly toasted that Philip might now have a legitimate heir, implying Alexander's bloodline was tainted by his mother's foreign origins. Alexander hurled his cup at the man, shouting, "What am I then? A bastard?" Philip drew his sword and lunged at his own son, but stumbled and fell in his drunken rage. Alexander mocked him. "Here is the man who prepares to cross from Europe to Asia, yet he cannot even cross from one couch to another." That night, Alexander fled with his mother to Epirus into voluntary exile. For months, father and son remained estranged, while the court buzzed with rumors about succession. Eventually, diplomats managed to reconcile them, and Alexander returned to Pella, but trust between them had been broken. The tension in the royal household grew unbearable, with Olympias constantly warning Alexander that Philip might disinherit him. Philip began planning his greatest ambition yet, an invasion of the Persian Empire, the superpower of the ancient world. In 336 BC, as preparations for the Persian campaign continued, Philip arranged a grand celebration for the marriage of his daughter. Nobles and ambassadors from across Greece gathered in the ancient Macedonian capital of Aigai for the festivities. On the second day, as Philip entered the theatre, he walked ahead of his bodyguards to display his confidence and power before the assembled Greeks. Suddenly, one of his own bodyguards, a young nobleman named Pausanias, rushed forward with a hidden dagger. Before anyone could react, Pausanias plunged the blade into Philip's chest. The king who had unified Greece and prepared to humble Persia died almost instantly. Chaos erupted in the theatre as Pausanias fled toward waiting horses, but Philip's other guards pursued him. They caught him quickly and killed him on the spot, ensuring he could never reveal who had ordered the assassination. To this day, the truth remains shrouded in mystery. Was it a personal vendetta, a Persian plot, or something more sinister? Many whispered that Olympias had orchestrated her husband's murder, perhaps even with Alexander's knowledge. But no evidence was ever proven, and both mother and son denied any involvement. What was certain was this: at 20 years old, Alexander was now king of Macedon. The Greek city-states, seeing an opportunity in the transition of power, immediately began to revolt. Thebes, Athens, and others declared they would no longer submit to a boy king. The Persian Empire watched with interest, hoping Macedon would collapse into civil war. Alexander's own nobles doubted him, suggesting he abandon his father's Asian ambitions and focus on securing his precarious position. But Alexander was not his father. Where Philip had been patient and calculating, Alexander was bold and swift as lightning. Within days of his coronation, he executed potential rivals and secured the loyalty of the army. Then he turned his attention to the rebellious Greeks. He marched south so quickly that the city-states were stunned by his speed. At Thessaly, he outflanked the Greek defensive positions by having his men cut steps into the sheer face of Mount Ossa, bypassing the fortifications entirely. The Thessalians submitted without a fight. Athens, terrified, immediately sent ambassadors begging forgiveness. At Corinth, Alexander was confirmed as hegemon of the League of Corinth, inheriting his father's position as commander of the unified Greek forces. It was here that he allegedly met the philosopher Diogenes, who lived in a barrel and rejected all material possessions. When Alexander found him sunbathing, the young king asked if there was anything he could do for the wise man. Diogenes replied simply, "Yes, stand out of my sunlight." Alexander's companions were offended, but the king laughed and said, "If I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes." But not all Greeks submitted peacefully. Thebes remained defiant, believing rumors that Alexander had died in battle to the north. Alexander appeared before their walls with his entire army, giving them one chance to surrender. The Thebans refused, confident in their military tradition and sacred band of warriors. Alexander's response was ruthless and calculated to send a message that would echo across the ancient world. The conquest of the world. In 335 BC, Alexander stood before the walls of Thebes, a city that had dared to believe he was weak. The siege was brief and merciless. Alexander's forces breached the walls, and what followed was one of the most brutal suppressions in Greek history. 6,000 Thebans were killed in the fighting, and 30,000 were sold into slavery. The city itself was razed to the ground, every building destroyed except for the temples and the house of the poet Pindar. Alexander spared the poet's home as a symbol. Culture deserved respect, but rebellion would be annihilated. The destruction of Thebes sent shockwaves through Greece. No city dared challenge Macedonian authority again. With Greece secured, Alexander turned his eyes eastward toward the Persian Empire, the greatest power the world had ever known. The Persian Empire stretched from Egypt to India, ruling over millions of subjects and commanding wealth beyond imagination. Its emperor, Darius III, commanded armies that dwarfed anything Macedon could field. Most rulers would have considered such an invasion madness, but Alexander was not most rulers. In the spring of 334 BC, Alexander crossed the Hellespont into Asia with approximately 40,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. According to legend, he was the first to leap ashore, hurling his spear into the ground and claiming Asia as Spear-Won territory. He then traveled to Troy, where he honored the tomb of Achilles, his legendary ancestor and hero. Following ancient tradition, Alexander honored Achilles with the greatest reverence, a hero saluting another. He took sacred armor from the temple of Athena, which he would carry into every subsequent battle. Days later, Alexander faced his first test against the Persians at the Granicus River. The Persian satraps had assembled a defensive force along the steep riverbank. Confident the terrain would break any attack, Alexander's generals urged caution, but the young king ordered an immediate frontal assault. He personally led the companion cavalry into the river, water splashing around them as arrows darkened the sky. The fighting was brutal and personal. Alexander's helmet was split by a Persian noble's sword, and he would have died if his friend Clytus hadn't killed the attacker. But Alexander's courage inspired his men, and the Macedonian phalanx ground forward relentlessly. The Persian line broke, and the victory opened all of Western Asia Minor to Alexander's advance. City after city surrendered or was conquered as Alexander moved down the Ionian coast. But at Gordium, an ancient Phrygian city, Alexander encountered a legendary puzzle that had stumped visitors for centuries. The Gordian knot was an impossibly complex knot tied to an ancient wagon, with prophecy declaring that whoever untied it would rule all of Asia. Countless men had tried and failed to unravel its intricate loops. Alexander examined it briefly, then drew his sword and sliced through the knot with a single stroke. "What difference does it make how I loose it?" he supposedly declared, inventing a new solution through boldness rather than convention. The message was clear. Alexander would not be bound by the limitations others accepted. By 333 BC, Darius III could no longer ignore the Macedonian invasion. He personally assembled a massive army to crush the upstart king. The two forces met at Issus in a narrow coastal plain that negated the Persian numerical advantage. Darius commanded perhaps 100,000 men. Alexander had barely 40,000. But Alexander had studied the Persian way of war, understood their weaknesses, and possessed an army of disciplined veterans. As battle began, Alexander executed one of history's most audacious tactical maneuvers. While his phalanx held the center, he led his companion cavalry in an oblique charge directly toward Darius's position. The wedge formation of Macedonian horsemen smashed through the Persian lines like a spear point. Alexander himself fought in the front ranks, conspicuous in his armor and white-plumed helmet. He was wounded in the thigh, but continued fighting, driving toward the Persian emperor. Darius, seeing Alexander cutting through his guards, panicked and fled the battlefield in his chariot. The Persian army, seeing their god-king abandon them, collapsed into chaos. The victory was absolute, but more valuable than the military triumph was what Alexander captured in Darius's camp. Darius had fled so quickly, he left behind his mother, wife, and daughters. Alexander treated them with remarkable respect and courtesy, visiting them personally to assure them of their safety. He told Darius's mother, who had mistaken his companion Hephaestion for the king because he was taller, "He too is Alexander." This chivalrous treatment of noble Persian women would become legendary, demonstrating that Alexander sought not just to conquer, but to rule. From Issus, Alexander turned south toward Phoenicia and Egypt, rather than pursuing Darius directly. His strategic mind understood that controlling the Mediterranean coast would cut off Persian naval power. Most Phoenician cities submitted immediately. But Tyre, built on an island fortress, refused. The city had never been taken by siege, protected by massive walls, and the sea itself. Alexander's generals suggested bypassing it, but the young king was obsessed with eliminating any threat to his rear. For 7 months, Alexander laid siege to Tyre, building a massive causeway across the water to reach the island. The Tyrians fought desperately, dropping boulders on the causeway, sending fire ships against the siege towers, and defending their walls with fanatical courage. But Alexander was relentless, eventually bringing up siege engines and breaching the fortifications. When Tyre finally fell in 332 BC, Alexander's revenge was severe. 8,000 Tyrians were killed and 30,000 sold into slavery. The causeway Alexander built remains to this day, permanently connecting Tyre to the mainland. After Tyre, Alexander swept through Palestine and into Egypt, where he was welcomed as a liberator from Persian rule. The Egyptians, who had chafed under Persian occupation, crowned him as pharaoh and declared him the son of the god Amun-Ra. Alexander embraced these divine honors, whether from genuine belief, political calculation, or a fusion of both. He founded the city of Alexandria on Egypt's Mediterranean coast, which would become one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. Then, driven by a mysterious compulsion, Alexander journeyed across the brutal Libyan desert to the Oracle of Siwa. This remote temple was sacred to Amun, whom Greeks identified with Zeus. What happened inside the Oracle sanctuary remains one of history's great mysteries, as Alexander never fully revealed what he was told, but he emerged with an unshakable conviction in his divine destiny and semi-divine status. His companions noticed a change. Alexander now believed himself chosen by the gods for unprecedented glory. In 331 BC, Alexander finally turned his attention back to Darius, who had spent 2 years assembling the largest army Persia could muster. The two forces met at Gaugamela in northern Mesopotamia, where Darius had chosen flat ground perfect for his superior numbers and scythed chariots. The Persian army stretched beyond sight, perhaps 200,000 strong, against Alexander's 47. In command, Parmenion, suggested a night attack to offset their new Hephaestion for the king because he was taller. He too is Alexander. This chivalrous treatment of noble Persian women would become legendary, demonstrating that Alexander sought not just to conquer, but to rule. From Issus, Alexander turned south toward Phoenicia and Egypt, rather than pursuing Darius directly. His strategic mind understood that controlling the Mediterranean coast would cut off Persian naval power. Most Phoenician cities submitted immediately, but Tyre, built on an island fortress, refused. The city had never been taken by siege, protected by massive walls, and the sea itself. Alexander's generals suggested bypassing it, but the young king was obsessed with eliminating any threat to his rear. For 7 months, Alexander laid siege to Tyre, building a massive causeway across the water to reach the island. The Tyrians fought desperately, dropping boulders on the causeway, sending fire ships against the siege towers, and defending their walls with fanatical courage. But Alexander was relentless, eventually bringing up siege engines and breaching the fortifications. When Tyre finally fell in 332 BC, Alexander's revenge was severe. 8,000 Tyrians were killed and 30,000 sold into slavery. The causeway Alexander built remains to this day, permanently connecting Tyre to the mainland. After Tyre, Alexander swept through Palestine and into Egypt, where he was welcomed as a liberator from Persian rule. The Egyptians, who had chafed under Persian occupation, crowned him as pharaoh and declared him the son of the god Amun-Ra. Alexander embraced these divine honors, whether from genuine belief, political calculation, or a fusion of both. He founded the city of Alexandria on Egypt's Mediterranean coast, which would become one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. Then, driven by a mysterious compulsion, Alexander journeyed across the brutal Libyan desert to the Oracle of Siwa. This remote temple was sacred to Amun, whom Greeks identified with Zeus. What happened inside the Oracle sanctuary remains one of history's great mysteries, as Alexander never fully revealed what he was told, but he emerged with an unshakable conviction in his divine destiny and semi-divine status. His companions noticed a change. Alexander now believed himself chosen by the gods for unprecedented glory. In 331 BC, Alexander finally turned his attention back to Darius, who had spent 2 years assembling the largest army Persia could muster. The two forces met at Gaugamela in northern Mesopotamia, where Darius had chosen flat ground perfect for his superior numbers and scythed chariots. The Persian army stretched beyond sight, perhaps 200,000 strong against Alexander's 47,000. The night before battle, Alexander's generals found him calmly studying maps and planning. His second-in-command, Parmenion, suggested a night attack to offset their numerical disadvantage. Alexander refused with words that revealed his character. "I will not steal victory." At dawn, the Battle of Gaugamela began with Darius unleashing his feared scythed chariots. But Alexander's men opened lanes in their formation, allowing the chariots to pass through harmlessly, then closed ranks and continued their advance. The Macedonian phalanx held the center, while Alexander once again led his companion cavalry in an oblique charge. He aimed directly for Darius, just as at Issus, seeking to decapitate Persian leadership. The cavalry wedge punched through the Persian lines, and once again Darius fled the field. This time the victory was even more devastating. The Persian Empire effectively ceased to exist as a unified power. Alexander pursued Darius, but the Persian emperor was murdered by his own satraps before Alexander could reach him. When Alexander found Darius's body, he covered it with his own cloak and ensured the fallen emperor received a royal burial. "You should not have ended this way," Alexander reportedly said, seeing perhaps a mirror of his own mortality. With Darius dead, Alexander proclaimed himself King of Kings, Emperor of Persia, assuming the ancient titles and legitimacy of Persian rule. He entered Babylon in triumph, where he was greeted with flowers and hymns. Then he marched to Persepolis, the ceremonial capital and symbol of Persian power. There, Alexander did something uncharacteristic and controversial. He burned the great palace of Xerxes. Some accounts say it was deliberate revenge for Persia's burning of Athens a century earlier. Others claim it was a drunken accident during a celebration. But the symbolic message was unmistakable. The old Persian order was finished, and a new era had begun. Alexander now controlled an empire that stretched from Greece to Central Asia, wealth beyond measure, and millions of subjects. He was 25 years old. Most conquerors would have consolidated their gains and enjoyed their triumph. But Alexander's ambition had no limit, his hunger for glory no satisfaction point. He looked eastward beyond the known boundaries of civilization and decided to continue. There are no more worlds to conquer, he would later supposedly lament, though this was far from true. His army, however, was growing weary of endless campaigns and longed to return home with their plunder. The greatest test of Alexander's leadership was about to begin. The price of glory. By 330 BC, Alexander had achieved what no Greek had ever accomplished. He had conquered the Persian Empire. But rather than celebrating and consolidating his gains, he announced his intention to push even further into the unknown East. His Macedonian veterans, who had followed him for years through countless battles, began to question their young king's judgment. They had gold, glory, and captured Persian wives. Many wanted nothing more than to return home. But Alexander's vision had expanded beyond mere conquest. He now dreamed of uniting East and West into a single civilization. He began adopting Persian customs and dress, incorporating Persian nobles into his administration and army. He performed the Persian proskynesis, a ceremonial bow that Greeks associated with worship of gods, not greeting of kings. His Macedonian companions were scandalized, viewing these changes as betrayals of Greek and Macedonian identity. Tension grew between Alexander's original companions and his newer Persian associates, and the army that had once been united in purpose now fractured along cultural lines. In 330 BC, as Alexander pursued Darius's murderers into Bactria, a conspiracy formed among his own men. Philotas, son of Alexander's most trusted general Parmenion, was accused of knowing about a plot against the king's life. Under torture, Philotas confessed, whether truthfully or to end his agony remains debated. Alexander had no choice but to execute Philotas according to Macedonian military law. But then he made a decision that haunted him. He ordered the assassination of Parmenion, who was commanding troops hundreds of miles away. Parmenion had served Alexander's father Philip and had been instrumental in every victory. But Alexander feared the old general might rebel to avenge his son. The murder of Parmenion without trial shocked the army and revealed how paranoid and ruthless Alexander had become. The campaigns in Bactria and Sogdiana proved to be Alexander's most difficult, a grinding guerrilla war against mounted nomadic peoples. The Sogdian rebels were led by Spitamenes, a brilliant tactician who repeatedly ambushed Macedonian forces and vanished into the steppes. For 2 years, Alexander struggled to pacify the region, establishing cities and garrisons to hold territory. It was during this period that Alexander married Roxana, daughter of a Bactrian nobleman. The marriage was partly political, meant to bind the local aristocracy to his rule, but accounts suggest genuine attraction. Roxana was renowned for her beauty, and Alexander's marriage to a non-Greek further alienated his Macedonian traditionalists. In 328 BC, Alexander's inner circle gathered in Samarkand for a feast celebrating their victories. Wine flowed freely, and the atmosphere grew heated as old companions debated Alexander's adoption of Persian customs. Clytus the Black, who had saved Alexander's life at the Granicus River, drunkenly began criticizing the king. He praised Philip's achievements while disparaging Alexander's, claiming the Macedonian army deserved credit for the victories. not Alexander's divine pretensions. Alexander, also drunk, became enraged as Clytus continued his tirade, and the tension escalated rapidly with friends trying to separate them. But Clytus pushed further, quoting Euripides about old warriors making way for younger men. In a fit of rage, Alexander seized a spear from a guard and hurled it at Clytus. The spear pierced Clytus's chest, killing him instantly. The room fell silent as Alexander realized what he had done. He had murdered one of his closest friends and saviors. For 3 days, Alexander locked himself away, refusing food and water, weeping inconsolably. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, killing a companion in drunken anger. The incident revealed the immense psychological pressure Alexander was under and the darkness growing within him. His friends eventually coaxed him from his grief, but the guilt would haunt him for the rest of his life. The army, meanwhile, watched their king with growing unease, wondering who might be next to face his wrath. Despite these internal struggles, Alexander's military genius remained undiminished. In 327 BC, he faced the fortress of Iornos in modern-day Pakistan, a mountain stronghold considered impregnable. Legend said even Heracles had failed to capture it. Alexander, obsessed with surpassing his mythological ancestor, personally led the assault. His engineers constructed a massive ramp up the cliff face while archers provided covering fire. Against all odds, the Macedonians took the fortress, and Alexander added another impossible victory to his legend. From there, Alexander entered India, crossing the Indus River into territories unknown to Greeks. In 326 BC, he faced his greatest military challenge, King Porus and his war elephants at the Hydaspes River. Porus commanded an army that included 200 war elephants, creatures the Macedonians had never faced in such numbers. Alexander executed a brilliant tactical deception, making Porus believe he would ford the river at one point, while secretly crossing upstream with his cavalry. When battle was joined, the Macedonian phalanx faced the terrifying charge of the elephants. The beasts trampled men and horses, their trumpeting screams drowning out commands. But Alexander's men stood firm, targeting the elephants with javelins and driving them back into Porus's own infantry. The battle was ferocious, lasting 8 hours in monsoon rains and mud. Eventually, the Macedonians prevailed, but at great cost. Alexander's beloved horse, Bucephalus, died from wounds received in the fighting. Alexander wept over his companion of 20 years and founded a city named Bucephala in his honor. When the wounded King Porus was brought before Alexander, the victor asked how he wished to be treated. Porus replied simply, "Like a king." Alexander, impressed by his dignity, not only restored Porus's kingdom but expanded it, gaining a loyal ally. After Hydaspes, Alexander announced his intention to continue eastward to the Ganges River and beyond, speaking of reaching the ends of the earth and the ocean that supposedly encircled the world. But his army had reached its breaking point after 8 years of continuous campaigning, traveling thousands of miles from home. Many had families they hadn't seen, some had children they'd never met, and they had fought in every conceivable terrain against every imaginable enemy. At the Hyphasis River, the army simply refused to go further. No matter how Alexander pleaded, threatened, or inspired, his men would not move. Conus, one of Alexander's most respected commanders, spoke for the army, reminding Alexander that they had achieved glory beyond measure and deserved to see their homeland again. Alexander sulked in his tent for 3 days, hoping the army would change its mind, but they would not. For the first time in his life, Alexander could not bend others to his will through force of personality. Finally, he sacrificed to the gods for favorable omens to continue, and the priests conveniently reported negative signs. Alexander announced they would turn back, though everyone knew the army's refusal had forced his hand, and 12 massive altars were erected to mark the easternmost point of Alexander's conquests. The return journey would prove even deadlier than the advance. Alexander decided to return to Babylon via southern routes to explore and subdue new territories, with part of the army traveling by fleet down the Indus River and along the coast. Alexander led a land force through the Gedrosian Desert, one of the most inhospitable regions on Earth. The crossing was catastrophic. Thousands died from heat, thirst, and flash floods in dry riverbeds. Supplies ran out, discipline broke down, and men went mad from dehydration. Alexander shared his soldiers' hardships, refusing water when there wasn't enough for all. In one famous incident, when troops found a helmet full of water and offered it to Alexander, he poured it on the sand rather than drink alone. But these gestures couldn't save the men who died in that desert. Some historians believe 3/4 of Alexander's force perished. By late 325 BC, the bedraggled survivors reached Carmania, where they reunited with the fleet. Alexander discovered that many of his satraps, believing he had died in India, had been embezzling, oppressing the population, and raising private armies. His response was swift and merciless. Corrupt officials were executed by the hundreds, restoring order but further demonstrating Alexander's increasingly authoritarian tendencies. In 324 BC at Susa, Alexander staged a mass wedding between Macedonian officers and Persian noblewomen. He himself married 2 more wives, Statira, daughter of Darius III, and Parysatis, daughter of Artaxerxes III. Alexander's vision was clear. He wanted to create a mixed Greek-Persian ruling class to administer his empire. But most of his Macedonian officers viewed these marriages as forced and divorced their Persian wives as soon as they could. That same year, Alexander announced that 30,000 Persian youths who had been trained in Macedonian warfare would be incorporated into the army. The Macedonian veterans saw this as a replacement force, a sign that Alexander no longer valued his original companions. At Opis, the army mutinied when Alexander tried to discharge his oldest and wounded veterans. The confrontation was shocking. Macedonian soldiers who had followed Alexander for over a decade now stood against him. Alexander responded with characteristic boldness, executing the ringleaders and announcing he would rely on Persian troops instead. The Macedonians, faced with the prospect of being replaced, backed down and begged forgiveness. Alexander wept and reconciled with them, but the incident revealed how fragile his control had become. The empire was held together by one man's will, and that man was showing signs of cracking. In autumn 324 BC, Alexander's closest friend, Hephaestion, who had been his constant companion since childhood, died suddenly of fever. Alexander's grief was overwhelming and disturbing. He lay on Hephaestion's body for an entire day, refusing to move. He ordered elaborate mourning rituals, executed Hephaestion's doctor, and planned a funeral monument that would cost the equivalent of a year's revenue. He even sent to the oracle of Ammon, asking if Hephaestion could be worshipped as a god. The loss of Hephaestion removed the one person who could moderate Alexander's increasingly erratic behavior. Without his friend's counsel, Alexander became more isolated, more paranoid, and more convinced of his own divinity. The signs were clear. The strain of constant warfare, political intrigue, and the weight of ruling an empire was taking its toll. And Alexander was no longer the brilliant young king who had inspired absolute loyalty. He was becoming unpredictable, dangerous, and alone at the pinnacle of power. The question was no longer what Alexander would conquer next, but whether he would survive himself. Tentar novamente. O Claude pode cometer erros, confira sempre as respostas. Sonne 4.5. The Last Days of a Conqueror. In the spring of 323 BC, Alexander arrived in Babylon, the jewel of his empire, and the city he had chosen as his capital. Babylon's massive walls and hanging gardens symbolized the ancient civilizations Alexander had absorbed into his dominion. But as he approached the city, Chaldean priests warned him not to enter, prophesying death if he did. The superstitious among his entourage urged him to heed the warning, but Alexander dismissed it as barbarian nonsense. "How can I rule an empire if I fear to enter my own capital?" he reportedly said, and marched through Babylon's gates. At 32 years old, Alexander was planning his next campaigns, an invasion of Arabia, followed by expeditions to Carthage and Rome. His ambition remained limitless, even as his body showed the accumulated damage of 13 years of continuous warfare. He bore scars from wounds received in Egypt, Persia, Central Asia, and India, and an arrow wound to his chest from the siege of the Malian city had nearly killed him and never fully healed. His physicians warned him to moderate his lifestyle, but Alexander continued his pattern of heavy drinking and exhausting activity. In late May 323 BC, Alexander attended a prolonged banquet hosted by his friend Medius of Larissa. The party stretched late into the night, with wine flowing freely according to Macedonian custom. Alexander, who had been abstaining somewhat since Hephaestion's death, drank heavily that evening. Near dawn, he suddenly complained of intense pain in his abdomen, as if struck by a spear. He was carried to his bed, where fever quickly set in. At first, his physicians weren't overly concerned. Fevers were common, and Alexander had survived worse. But over the next days, his condition deteriorated rapidly. The fever burned hotter, he couldn't keep food down, and his legendary strength began to fade. By June 3rd, Alexander could no longer speak clearly, though he was still conscious. His commanders came to his bedside, and according to accounts, each one filed past to pay respects. When Perdiccas asked who should inherit the empire, Alexander supposedly whispered, "To the strongest," or possibly to Crateros. Some sources claim he said nothing at all, merely gesturing weakly toward his generals. On June 7th, Alexander could no longer recognize his friends, his eyes glazed with fever. His Macedonian soldiers, hearing their king was dying, demanded to see him one last time. In a remarkable scene, the entire army filed through his chamber, thousands of men passing by in silence. Alexander could not speak, but he acknowledged each soldier with slight movements of his head and eyes, and many wept openly, knowing they were seeing their invincible commander for the last time. On June 10th, 323 BC, as the sun set over Babylon, Alexander the Great died. He was 32 years old and had ruled for 12 years and 8 months. In that brief time, he had conquered an empire spanning 3 continents and over 2 million square miles. He had never lost a battle, founded over 20 cities, and changed the course of human history, but he left no clear heir, no stable succession plan, and an empire too vast to be held together without his personal authority. The cause of Alexander's death remains one of history's great mysteries. Ancient sources describe symptoms consistent with various diseases: malaria, typhoid fever, or West Nile virus, all endemic to Mesopotamia. Some modern scholars have suggested acute pancreatitis from years of heavy drinking. Others point to the sudden onset and propose poisoning, noting that several generals had motives to eliminate him. Rumors spread immediately that Antipater, Alexander's viceroy in Macedon, had sent his son Cassander with poison from Aristotle. The theory gained traction because Cassander had recently arrived in Babylon and had been humiliated by Alexander, but most historians consider assassination unlikely given the witness accounts and symptom progression. Another theory proposed recently suggests Alexander may not have been dead when they thought he was. He may have suffered from Guillain-Barré syndrome, which can cause paralysis while leaving consciousness intact. According to this theory, Alexander was actually alive, but paralyzed when they began funeral preparations 6 days after his death. The truth died with Alexander, leaving only speculation and legend. His body was prepared for burial according to Egyptian and Babylonian traditions. placed in a gold sarcophagus filled with honey. But before Alexander could be buried, his empire exploded into chaos. His generals, known as the Diadochi, or successors, immediately began fighting over his territories. Perdiccas claimed the regency. His successor kingdoms would dominate the Mediterranean and Near East for 3 centuries. Even in India, Alexander appears in local histories as the Great Sikander, whose invasion marked a turning point in subcontinental affairs. In modern times, Alexander remains controversial. Scholars debate whether he was a visionary uniter of civilizations or a brutal conqueror. Some see him as a genius who dreamed of a cosmopolitan world state transcending ethnic divisions, while others view him as a megaloman military prowess, creating institutions that outlasted him. Or would the empire have collapsed anyway, too vast and diverse to be governed even by Alexander himself? Some historians suggest his early death actually enhanced his legend by preserving him at the peak of his power. Had he lived, he might have faced rebellions, administrative failures, and the mundane challenges of governance that tarnish reputations. Instead, he died young, beautiful, and victorious, achieving the immortal glory he craved. In one sense, Alexander succeeded humanity's sense of what was possible. He proved that a single individual, with enough courage, intelligence, and will, could reshape history. From a small kingdom in Macedonia, he built the largest empire the world had yet his influence. The young king who died at 32 achieved immortality after all, not as a god, but as the man who showed humanity the shape of its connected future. This was another episode of Iconic Figures. Subscribe to our channel.
And known to history as Alexander the Great of Macedon, was born either on the 20th or the 21st of July in the year 356 BC. He was born in the city of Pella, the capital of the Kingdom of Macedon. Alexander's father was King Philip II of Macedon. He had succeeded to the throne of Macedon 3 years earlier and would begin a series of expansions of his kingdom which were hugely important precursors to Alexander's own accomplishments. Unlike his son, though, who would become known for his cultured rule as well as his conquests, Philip was the paragon of what the Greeks considered to be an uncultured barbarian from the northern limits of the Greek world. Alexander's mother was Olympias of Epirus, the daughter of King Neoptolemus of Epirus, an ancient kingdom straddling the borders of modern-day southern Albania and northwestern Greece. Though she was the 4th of either 7 or 8 wives that Philip took, Olympias was considered his senior wife, and Alexander seems to have been quickly established as his father's heir upon his birth, despite having a slightly older half-brother from one of his father's other marriages. There are numerous fables surrounding how Olympias gave birth to Alexander, one suggesting that her womb was struck by a lightning bolt during the consummation of her marriage to Philip, and that as a result, Zeus, the king of the gods and a deity associated with lightning, was actually. Alexander's life must be considered against the changing political background of not just the Kingdom of Macedon, but the wider Greek world and its relationship with the great Persian Empire in the 4th century BC. The Greeks, or Hellenes, as they termed themselves, had formed themselves into hundreds of city-states around mainland Greece and the islands of the Aegean Sea in centuries gone by. These city-states had then sent out colonies to establish new cities and towns in places as far afield as southern Italy and Sicily, Massalia in southern France, where modern-day Marseille stands, and around the Black Sea, in places like the coast of the Crimean Peninsula. Thus, although there was no centralized Greek state to speak of, and power was decentralized amongst hundreds of city-states by the end of the 6th century BC, the Greeks were collectively a very strong and rich people as a result of their social development, industry, and extensive trade. It was their wealth which led the nascent Persian Empire, which already ruled Persia, Mesopotamia, the Levant, the Caucasus, Anatolia, and Egypt, to try and invade and conquer the Greek mainland on 2 separate occasions in the early 5th century BC. Yet, on both occasions, and especially so during the second invasion in 480 BC and 479 BC, the Greeks had united against their common foe and managed to expel the invaders from their soil. This all pointed towards the strength of the Greeks, if they could be united under one ruler. In Alexander's time, that unifying power would be the kingdom of Macedon. Macedon lay in what are today northern Greece and North Macedonia. It was considered to be on the northern periphery of the Greek world, and its inhabitants were rude, quasi-barbarians in the eyes of many Greeks in the urbane cities like Athens and Corinth. Nevertheless, the Argead dynasty, which emerged as the rulers of a kingdom of Macedon here in the early 7th century BC, did absorb many elements of Greek culture over time. At the same time, their main political relations were with semi-nomadic groups such as the Illyrians, Molossians, and Thracians to the west, north, and east. Alexander's father, Philip, began a rapid period of expansion, reducing these tribes to the status of vassals or allies. He then turned southwards. Here, the Greeks had been weakened by the long Peloponnesian War that had pitted Athens and her allies against the Spartans and their many allies. When that conflict ended in 404 BC, after 27 long years of fighting, Athens was crippled as a power, and Sparta found itself triumphant. But even it was weakened by the fighting, and before long its hegemony over the Greek world was challenged by Thebes, the leader of the Boeotian League that won a great victory over the Spartans at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC. Thebes still remained, but Philip would soon be on his way to building an empire that stretched from modern-day Albania northeast to the Black Sea and from modern-day Bulgaria south to the Peloponnese. There are 5 major sources for the life of Alexander the Great. The most detailed of these, by some margin, is the Anabasis of Alexander by Arrian of Nicomedia, a 2nd century AD Greco-Roman historian. This is a fulsome account of Alexander's campaigns against the Persian Empire and the powers further east in Bactria towards India. Anabasis means a march or journey. A near contemporary of Arrian's, the Greco-Roman historical biographer Plutarch, wrote a life of Alexander as part of his monumental series of biographies comparing the lives of eminent Greeks and Romans. Much is written of the life of Alexander and his conquests in a substantial section of the Bibliotheca Historica, or Library of History, which was written by Diodorus Siculus, a Greek historian who lived in Sicily in the 1st century BC. Our fourth source is the Historiae Alexandri Magni, or Histories of Alexander the Great. This is the only full Latin history of Alexander the Great and his conquests written in ancient times to have survived down to the present day. It was written by Quintus Curtius Rufus, a Roman historian who lived in the 1st century AD. Finally, a 2nd century AD Roman historian, Marcus Justinus Frontinus, wrote an epitome of a now lost history of Alexander the Great, written by an earlier historian called Pompeius Trogus. All of these 5 sources suffer from being written in or around half a millennium after the time of Alexander the Great. However, we do know that they used sources which had been written much earlier, but which are now lost, notably a history of Alexander written by Cleitarchus, a Greek historian who lived in the time of Alexander and completed his history about 20 years after Alexander's death. Fragments of Cleitarchus's work are also extant through quotations in numerous other ancient texts, such as the geographical works of Strabo. With all of these works, as well as a mass of archaeological and material evidence, we can reconstruct Alexander's life quite substantially. We know much more about how Alexander was educated than we do for almost any other figure in ancient times. This is solely because he was tutored by the great Greek polymath and scholar Aristotle. Born in 384 BC, Aristotle had spent nearly 2 decades at the philosopher Plato's academy in Athens, a master who in turn had been taught by Socrates. Before Aristotle accepted an offer from King Philip of Macedon in 348 BC to head to Pella to educate the crown prince Alexander. He arrived there in either 347 or 346 BC and became Alexander's primary tutor when he was 10 years of age. Given Aristotle's wide-ranging interests in everything from philosophy and political science to botany and biology, Alexander's education was broad. Aristotle also taught his young charge the Homeric cycles about the legendary Trojan War, and it was from these that Alexander developed his strong desire for military glory. Alexander took a copy of the Iliad that Aristotle had given him annotated in the margins with him on his Persian campaigns years later. This education was also important in Alexander's social development. He was taught alongside the sons of leading Macedonian nobles like Hephaestion and Cassander, individuals who he grew up with and who became his most trusted companions and generals in later life. We have an unusually large amount of detail about Alexander's personality and appearance, though the ancient accounts are somewhat contradictory. He was reputedly handsome, though short in stature, with Curtius Rufus suggesting that when Alexander sat on one of the great thrones of the Persian kings in later life, his feet did not reach the floor, and he had to order a footstool to be brought to disguise this fact. Most accounts suggest he had brownish-blonde hair, though again there are some that suggest otherwise, with one even claiming that his hair had a reddish tinge to it. Portraits of him on coins, paintings, and sculptures were carefully curated to cast the Macedonian in the fairest light possible, but from these we can nevertheless determine that he had a straight nose, a firm protruding jawline, and fairly penetrating eyes. He was a cultivated young man, interested in the great writers of the Greek world, and yet also curious about the cultures of the people he conquered. But this was allied with a resolute brutality which saw him mass murder and enslave the inhabitants of conquered cities that resisted him. He patronized the arts and learning, was intelligent, though prone to stubbornness and emotional outbursts, a factor which was exacerbated by his fondness for wine, with several ancient chroniclers itemizing his heavy drinking bouts. His sexuality remains a mystery. Several passages in Plutarch's Life of Alexander could be interpreted as suggesting he was gay or bisexual, and his relationship with Hephaestion has elicited endless speculation. However, there is no concrete evidence to suggest what his sexual orientation was, one way or the other. One of Alexander's most enduring lifelong companions was his horse, Bucephalus. The horse's name derived from a scar or mark on one of its thighs, which resembled a bull. This was otherwise a large black steed with a distinctive white furrow on its brow in the shape of a star. Plutarch relates a colourful tale about how a horse trader came through Macedon around 344 BC when Alexander was 12 years of age. Bucephalus was shown to the Macedonian king, but he displayed little interest in purchasing a steed which seemed unruly and could not be ridden, while the trader was demanding an unusually high sum of 13 talents of silver. At this juncture, Alexander came forward and convinced his father to buy the horse if he could tame it and manage to ride it. This Alexander, despite his small size at the time, duly did, impressing his father in the process, who then bought the horse for his son. Bucephalus would go on to serve as Alexander's main horse for virtually the remainder of his life, nearly 20 years. The story, though, is quite probably an invention, one designed to mimic tales of the great Greek warrior Achilles and his prized steeds. Of his alleged taming of Bucephalus, Alexander was about to enter his adult years by the standards of the ancient world, an era which did not have the concept of adolescence, with people instead believing that children became adults when they reached their 13th or 14th year. His education under Aristotle continued down to around 340 BC, but he was also increasingly spending time being trained by his father in the rigors of government and war. He was considered sufficiently well advanced in this role that when Philip led a campaign against the Thracians around 340 BC, Alexander was left in charge of the government in Pella. A year later, he played a role in the military campaigns of the Fourth Sacred War, a short-lived conflict in 339 BC in which Philip used a sacrilegious act by the citizens of Amphissa to the south of Macedon as a pretext for imposing greater control over the region. This, in turn, led to an alliance amongst several Greek city-states against Macedon to try and resist the imposition of complete Macedonian rule over mainland Greece. Led by Thebes, Athens, and Corinth, the war culminated in the famous Battle of Chaeronea in the Boeotia region on the 2nd of August 338 BC. Alexander fought alongside his father at this engagement, in which the Macedonians won such a comprehensive victory that the resistance of the mainland Greek city-states was broken. A League of Corinth was formed thereafter, also known as the Hellenic League, as a federation of the Greek city-states bound together under Macedonian hegemony. A period of some unrest followed between Alexander and his father. During this, various matters became contentious between king and heir, and for a time Alexander spent several months in self-imposed exile amongst the Illyrians. When he returned, a proposed marriage to the daughter of Pixodorus, a Persian governor of Caria in western Anatolia, was not agreed to by Philip and had to be abandoned. Given the fraying of the relationship between Philip and Alexander, and rumours that the king intended to bypass his son and make one of his half-brothers the new heir, it is unsurprising that when Philip was assassinated not long afterwards, suspicions arose that the incident may have been a palace coup. The killer was Pausanias of Orestes, one of Philip II's bodyguards and a trusted individual who had sufficiently close access to the king to carry out the deed on the 21st of October, 336 BC. Pausanias subsequently fled and was hunted down and stabbed to death, precluding the possibility of any questioning or investigation to discover what his motives were and who else he might have been collaborating with. We have only one contemporary source for these events, a description by Aristotle, who claims that Pausanias acted alone and was motivated by having been offended by Philip's uncle-in-law, a man by the name of Attalus. Aristotle would have defended his young charge Alexander from any accusations of foul play in any event, and we may never know for sure if Alexander conspired to have his father murdered. What we do know is that any suggestions that one of Alexander's half-siblings might succeed Philip were now brushed aside. At 20 years of age, Alexander succeeded as King Alexander III of Macedon. With such a young and untested monarch replacing Philip, the ruthless warrior king who had expanded Macedon into a great power, many individuals and vassals were tempted to try and move against young Alexander. He proved more than capable of handling such threats. He had Amyntas killed, his cousin, who had briefly ruled as king of Macedon as a child in 359 BC, before being superseded by Philip, so as to stave off any threat in that direction to his rule. Several other Macedonian rivals were put to the sword. He then mustered several thousand Macedonian cavalry and commenced a swift campaign northwards against the Thracians, who had entered into revolt almost as soon as they learned of the assassination of Alexander's father. Thus did Alexander consolidate his control over Macedon and the southern Balkans, all while also handling the supposed depredations of his mother, Olympias, an overzealous mother, if ever there was one, who, according to several accounts, ordered the murder of several of Philip II's children by his other wives, who might have posed a threat of any kind to Alexander's rule. Alexander's Balkan campaigns were simply a precursor to his much more ambitious design to conquer the Persian Empire. His father's role in this must be acknowledged. As early as the late 350s BC, Philip II had been supporting opponents of the Persians in Anatolia and Asia Minor, ancient names for what is now Turkey. There was also a strong Greek precedent for this. with the Spartans having launched numerous military expeditions half a century earlier against the Persian Empire, most notably the famous March of the 10,000 into the heart of the empire to interfere in a civil war which was underway there between 401 BC and 399 BC. Thus, Greek and Macedonian interference in Persian affairs was nothing new, but Alexander would not just seek to benefit from Persian weakness. Instead, he developed the vaulting ambition of conquering the entirety of the Persian Empire, something which he began preparing for from the moment that he ascended to the throne. It was for this reason that he dealt so brutally with any kind of resistance to his rule within Greece itself. When both Thebes and Athens also revolted against him not long after he ascended to the throne, he campaigned south and ordered the total destruction of the city of Thebes. He then divided its territory up among the neighboring cities of Boeotia. This done, Athens surrendered quickly. With the Greeks thus cowed, Alexander prepared to set off east to wage war on the Persians. It would result in one of the greatest military campaigns ever conducted. The Persian campaign would be fought by what is now termed the Hellenic Army, or Army of the Greeks. This integrated both Macedonian and Greek troops and differed considerably from traditional Macedonian fighting techniques that had largely relied on cavalry divisions centuries earlier. Instead, the new Macedonian fighting force, which again Philip was largely responsible for developing, relied on phalanxes. These were groups of heavily armoured infantrymen or hoplites that fought in well-ordered rectangular fighting divisions. Their main weapon was a long pike or spear known as the sarissa. Philip had introduced these to the Macedonian army. They were between 5 and 7 meters in length and were used at the front of the phalanx as a shield wall. The term phalanx derives from a word in Homer's Iliad which describes a tactical formation used by hoplite fighters. The phalanxes of massed hoplites, carrying their enormous spears, were able to stop any charge of massed cavalry in their tracks and would pose a devastating threat to the Persians. It was with approximately 50,000 such troops, a corps of some 5,000 cavalry, a moderate fleet, and auxiliary forces that Alexander crossed over the Hellespont into Anatolia in 334 BC, just 2 years after ascending to the throne. These figures concerning the size of his army are disputed, and even the ancient sources did not correlate in reporting them, while it seems wholly evident that Alexander was reinforced continuously from Greece and Macedon in the years that followed. Nevertheless, there is no doubt that Alexander and the Hellenic army were heavily outnumbered by the Persians. Alexander was the commander-in-chief of the army that headed off to conquer Persia in 334 BC. However, he had numerous generals that would be central to the campaign that followed. These were his companions, or hetairoi, as they were known in ancient times. Some of these were individuals who were Alexander's closest friends and allies, men he had grown up with only recently, like Hephaestion, Lysimachus, and Cassander, who were the same age as him and had been educated alongside him by Aristotle. Another was Ptolemy, a man around 10 years older than Alexander and rumoured by some to be an illegitimate child of King Philip II. Parmenion was a much older figure who had been a leading general of King Philip and represented continuity in the Macedonian army, as was the general Antigonus. Thus the companions, who also acted as the bodyguards, or somatophylakes, to Alexander in battle, were a combination of his closest childhood friends and also the leading military commanders of Macedon since the days of Philip II. The stages of the Persian campaign were marked by the Battle of the Granicus River. This was near the waterway now known as the Biga River, which lies in northwestern Turkey and was not very far from where the Macedonians had made their landings in Anatolia after crossing the Hellespont. The engagement was fought here in May of 334 BC, though the exact date is not known. The central government in Mesopotamia and Persia, the two ancient names for Iraq and Iran respectively, had not responded in any major fashion to the Macedonian invasion by this time, and had been mired in a civil war for several years prior to the launching of Alexander's campaign, one which had seen their king, Artaxerxes III, assassinated in 338 BC, and eventually replaced in 336 BC by Darius III, something which made the Persians all the more vulnerable. Hence, the Battle of the Granicus River was a clash between Alexander's forces and the local Persian ruler or satrap, Arcetes, and the men he had hastily assembled to face down the Macedonians. He was assisted by Memnon of Rhodes, a Greek commander from the island of Rhodes, who was allied with the Persians. At Granicus, the Persians were given a sobering taste of what lay ahead, with the massed Macedonian phalanxes inflicting a devastating defeat on them. Thousands of Persians and their allies were slain for the loss of just a few hundred Macedonians and Greeks, and the battle effectively left Alexander in control of Anatolia. The next year saw Alexander moving eastwards while consolidating control over Anatolia and Asia Minor. At the same time, Darius III was preparing his response and marched westwards. The two forces would meet in the second great battle of the Persian campaign, the Battle of Issus, on the 5th of November, 333 BC. This occurred in the southeastern extremity of modern-day Turkey, near the borders with both Lebanon and Syria. Alexander's hand was forced here after Darius had wisely tried to outflank Alexander's army and cut off his supply lines. It was an engagement which far eclipsed the Battle of the Granicus River. Modern analysis of the ancient sources, which tended to exaggerate the size of the Persian armies and minimize the size of the Hellenic army, argue that Alexander probably brought about 35,000 to 40,000 men onto the field. Darius almost certainly outnumbered him, with perhaps between 50,000 and 60,000 men, though nowhere near the 500,000 or more men that Arrian and Plutarch claimed fought there. In the initial foray, the Persians had the better of the fighting, taking advantage of the terrain to force the Macedonian phalanxes to march uphill near a river. This resulted in an initial retreat, but at this juncture Alexander led a fresh charge himself, during which he punctured through the Persian lines, leading a direct charge with his companions towards Darius and his bodyguards. This caused the Persian king to flee, an action which broke the Persian resolve and led to a mass flight from the battlefield. Many thousands of Persians and their allies were killed in the resulting rout as the Greeks and Macedonians pursued them from the field of battle. It was in the aftermath of the Battle of Issus that Alexander allegedly cut, or solved, the Gordian knot. This Gordian knot was a complex series of knots which had, allegedly, been used to secure an ox cart near the city of Gordium in Phrygia in Anatolia. According to local law, it had been tied there in ancient times by a peasant named Gordias, and nobody had ever solved the knot. Over time, it took on a religious overtone, and a local temple had come to surround it. As the account of Alexander's life and campaigns by Quintus Curtius Rufus tells us, the knot was comprised, quote, of several knots, all so tightly entangled that it was impossible to see how they were fastened together. Alexander, it should be noted, did not solve the problem of the knot. Instead, after briefly examining it and assessing the situation, he simply hacked through it with his sword, a blunt force solution to an intractable problem. Other accounts have Alexander simply untying the ox cart by removing a linchpin, thus rendering the knot superfluous. To be prevented from reaching his goals by complex and seemingly intractable problems. He would push forward, using whatever means necessary to impose his will on Persia. After the Battle of Issus, King Darius and his armies pulled back towards Mesopotamia with the goal of organizing a stouter defense of the core lands of the Persian Empire there and in Persia itself. Alexander and his Hellenic army consequently faced little resistance as they pushed onwards. He decided not to strike directly towards the heart of Persia, but rather turned south into the Levant. This would result in the most protracted siege of the entire Persian campaign. In January 332 BC, the Greeks and Macedonians arrived to the city of Tyre, an ancient and wealthy port that had been one of the great centres of the maritime trade of the Phoenicians for centuries, a people who, like the Greeks, lived in decentralized city-states, but who had also made enormous contributions to the culture of the Mediterranean. The modern English alphabet, for instance, is indebted to the Phoenician alphabet, the first major consonantal alphabet ever devised. A 7-month siege of Tyre followed, one made difficult by the fact that the city walls were built in such a way as to almost make the city an island. This required a lengthy period in which siege towers, boats, and a maritime causeway were built in order to undo the defences and breach the city walls. According to Arrian, when the city finally fell to the Macedonians in July 332 BC, so enraged was Alexander with the delay in his campaign that he ordered the massacre of thousands of the inhabitants and the enslavement of the remainder, consisting of tens of thousands of mostly women and children. At this juncture, Alexander made a curious decision. It would have made sense to now proceed onwards to Mesopotamia and Persia to inflict a final defeat on Darius and the Persians. Instead, he continued his march southwards and now intended to pacify Egypt before resuming his clash with the Persian king. This was a dangerous move, one which left his flank exposed to counterattacks from Mesopotamia, and even opened up the possibility that Darius would strike westwards into Asia Minor and Anatolia, sundering Alexander's land bridge back to Macedonia in the process. But Alexander was undismayed, buoyed by the surrender of numerous Phoenician and Canaanite cities throughout the Levant after the fall of Tyre, though the city of Gaza refused to surrender, leading to another bitter siege in which Alexander was wounded on the shoulder. Afterwards, he yet again engaged in a genocidal massacre of the population and sold the remainder into slavery. It was consequently with a fearsome reputation for massacring those who resisted him that Alexander arrived into Egypt in the autumn of 332 BC. The country, which had been under foreign rule anyway for centuries, surrendered to Alexander, while, for his part, he took steps to head immediately to some of the most venerated religious sites in the country, notably the temples to the gods at Memphis, near modern-day Cairo, where he made offerings in the Egyptian manner in order to win over the local population. Alexander would only spend a brief few months in Egypt, leaving again at the beginning of 331 BC to recommence the campaign into Mesopotamia. Still, his brief sojourn in the land of the Nile had a lasting impact. As he was progressing on his campaigns and conquering new territories, Alexander founded around 20 cities along the way, each of which was named Alexandria after himself. Several of these would never rise to become anything more than small towns, but the Alexandria that had been founded near the western edge of the River Nile Delta would be an incredible success story. In the decades that followed, as the Greek elites that emerged in Egypt began to rule the country from the north and away from the traditional centers of power further up the River Nile at Memphis and Luxor, and as trade and communication benefited from a northern port capital that was closely connected by sea to Greece and Macedon itself, Alexandria grew into a sprawling city. Moreover, under the patronage of the enlightened Ptolemaic monarchs here in the 3rd century BC, the Library of Alexandria was developed as the most extensive repository of knowledge in the ancient world, part of the wider mauseon of cultural complexes and temples in the center of the city. The city would also soon be home to one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the lighthouse of Pharos, built in the middle of the 3rd century BC on the small island of Pharos in the city's harbour. Alexander continued his campaigns into the Levant and Egypt. Darius had returned to the heart of his empire and tried to raise fresh armies while also sending peace overtures to Alexander. The latter became more and more desperate over time, as Darius began to offer the Macedonians extensive territory in return for an end to the war. It was all to no avail, and on the 1st of October 331 BC, after Alexander and his army marched northeastwards for several months, they met with the Persians in the decisive clash of the war. The Battle of Gaugamela took place in the Kurdistan region of what is now northern Iraq. As ever, the ancient sources enormously exaggerated the size of the Persian army. While it was nowhere near the 1,000,000 men that Arrian described, it is probable that Darius had a horde of some 80,000 or 90,000 men, roughly twice the size of Alexander's force of around 45,000 men, which had been reinforced from Macedon and Greece after years of campaigning. In the end, superior military tactics, particularly the use of the phalanxes to break the Persian chariot attacks, won the day for Alexander. Ultimately, Darius lost the engagement in the weeks before it, and should have used the Macedonian advance through the desert with thinly stretched supply lines as an opportunity to make hit-and-run attacks on Alexander's forces that would have crippled them over time. Alexander now marched southwards into the heart of Mesopotamia, the great land dominated by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where some of the ancient world's greatest cities lay. With Darius and his followers having fled into Persia, many of the cities of Mesopotamia surrendered to Alexander and the Macedonians. Moved eastwards towards Persia itself, a land which largely approximates to modern-day Iran, particularly the western half of the country. His goal was Persepolis, the capital of the Persian Empire in the Zagros Mountains. In January 330 BC, he won a considerable victory over a Persian army led by one of Darius's remaining commanders, Ariobarzanes, at the Persian Gate, a narrow mountain pass that was a natural defensive point located not far from Persepolis. With victory here, the route to Persepolis was largely cleared. The city was easily captured, and Alexander may have decided to burn it to the ground, though it remains unclear if the fire which destroyed much of it was accidental or not. With this, the Persian Empire had been all but conquered. Darius remained at large, fleeing ever further eastwards for a few months thereafter. However, he was soon murdered by Bessus, one of his former satraps in Bactria, the ancient name for Afghanistan. With his passing, the Persian royal line was declared to be at an end, and Alexander became ruler of all of the former lands of the Persian Empire. Alexander might have stopped at this juncture. He had achieved his ultimate goal, the conquest of Persia, a power that had threatened the independence of the Greek world, Macedon included, for 200 years. Surely the time was now right to move back westwards to Babylon and Mesopotamia and to begin consolidating his control over his vast new empire from its heartland. This was not what happened, though. Instead, Alexander told his men that they would continue eastwards. The lands here, Bactria and the Hindu Kush, needed to be pacified. They, too, had formed part of the Persian Empire from time to time, and Alexander wished to secure them rather than allowing the local rulers, like Bessus, to reassert their independence in the vacuum left by the collapse of Persian power. The Bactrian campaign of Alexander occurred between 330 BC and 328 BC. In undertaking this, he was leading his Hellenic army into lands which the Greeks and Macedonians knew a considerable amount about, but had never campaigned into in this manner. Clearly, there was some unrest amongst his followers at this decision. While travelling through Samarkand, in what is now Uzbekistan, which was then known as the city of Markanda, one of Alexander's oldest companions, Clytus the Black, a Macedonian commander who had apparently saved Alexander's life at the Battle of the River Granicus years earlier, voiced his opposition to Alexander's recent actions at a drunken banquet. In response, Alexander threw a pike, or multi-pronged spear, at Clytus, striking him in the chest and killing him, an act which Alexander later regretted. Despite this sign of dissent, he pressed on eastwards afterwards, reducing Bactria to his rule and campaigning through the Hindu Kush. There he founded a new city, the forerunner of modern-day Kandahar. Having thus pacified Bactria, he also took Roxana, the daughter of a local ruler, Oxyates, as his first wife, an event which was celebrated with a considerable feast, though one which also aroused further concerns about Alexander's conduct amongst the Greeks and Macedonians. Here, Alexander was marrying for the first time at nearly 30 years of age, though to a woman from a very foreign land, and with little knowledge of Greek and Macedonian customs, traditions, and social mores. After his campaign into Bactria and the pacification of the local lords and rulers there, many of his followers would have expected Alexander to turn back west to Persia and Mesopotamia. Was the eastern limit of where any power known to the Greeks had ever conquered. The Persians had exercised some considerable influence as far east as the western parts of modern-day Afghanistan and Pakistan, but no power from what we now call the Middle East, be it the Assyrians, the Babylonians, or anyone else, had ever ruled over lands any further to the east. In fact, very little was known about the world any further east towards the Himalayas and India. For instance, the 5th century BC historian, geographer, and social anthropologist Herodotus wrote about a land far to the east called India, a name derived from the Indus River, but for Herodotus, as for all Greeks up to Alexander's time, beyond the Indus River, which lies in northwestern India and along the border with Pakistan, was terra incognita, land which was unexplored and unknown. It is part of Alexander's legacy and mystique that he now decided to march onwards with his forces to India. Whether he wanted to simply explore lands which no Greek had before, at least that we know of, or whether he genuinely believed that he could conquer everything to the end of the world, remains a point of considerable debate. Alexander moved eastwards with upwards of 50,000 men in the second half of 327 BC. They headed into India through the Khyber Pass, though Alexander led a smaller contingent on a more northerly route to capture and fortify a fortress at Aeonus, near modern-day Piasa. This led the Greeks to the end of the Hindu Kush and into India proper. Here he was now heading into the territory of a local king by the name of Porus or Porus, who ruled over what is now the Punjab region of northern India. Here, in May 326 BC, Alexander and his army won yet another victory at the Battle of the Hydaspes River, the ancient name for the Jhelum River. Porus was captured in the clash, but it was a costly victory, and out of respect for the tactical nous of the Indian ruler, he reinstated him as a local vassal. This period was otherwise a traumatic one for Alexander, as his faithful companion, Bucephalus, died near the Hydaspes River. In honor of his long-serving steed, when he founded 2 cities by the banks of the river, Alexander ordered that one of them was to be called Alexandria Bucephalus. It wasn't only Alexander's horse that had reached the limits of its exertions. After defeating King Poros and nominally conquering the Punjab region, the Macedonians began to gather information about what lay further east. The information they acquired dismayed many. There was yet another great power lying there, what historians now call the Nanda Empire, a large state that controlled much of northern India east all the way to the Ganges River and the Bengal region. On learning this, and realizing that their exertions could go on forever if their king had his way, dissent began to brew amongst Alexander's men. As Plutarch tells us in his Life of Alexander concerning the Macedonian soldiers, quote, "The struggle with Porus blunted their courage and stayed their further advance into India. For having done all they could do to repulse an enemy who mustered only 20,000 infantry and 2,000 horse, they violently opposed Alexander when he insisted on crossing the river Ganges, also the width of which, as they learned, was 32 furlongs, its depth 100 fathoms, while its banks on the further side were covered with multitudes of men-at-arms and horsemen. Alexander's eastward campaign and conquests were at an end. Realizing that his men would go no further, he turned back and headed for Persia and Mesopotamia. The march back westwards took nearly a year, and was actually one of the costliest aspects of Alexander's campaigns, as many men were lost travelling through the harsh environment of Central Asia, often passing through the territories of local rulers who had not been fully pacified. Alexander reached the city of Susa in western Persia near the modern-day border with Iraq in 324 BC. There he began a process of administrative reform and consolidation of his territorial conquests. Much of this concerned rewarding the veterans in his army and decommissioning many of the soldiers involved now that he had completed his campaigning. He ordered explorations of the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, and some of the earliest Greek accounts of the Arabian Peninsula date to the 320s BC. This was a precursor to a planned campaign into Arabia in years to come. Other reforms included new measures to acquire taxes and income from the provinces, while there were also steps taken by Alexander to appease his new subjects, notably by venerating the tomb of Cyrus the Great at Pasargadae, the resting place of the revered founder of the Persian Empire 2 centuries earlier. His time back in Persia, though, was marred by the death of his oldest friend, closest companion, and second-in-command, Hephaestion, from some local disease that resulted in a severe fever. Distraught, Alexander ordered an extensive period of mourning and numerous honours to be bestowed on his dead friend, with a magnificent funeral held that celebrated Hephaestion as a quasi-divine being. Not long before Hephaestion's death, Alexander had overseen one of the most striking acts of ethnic and cultural integration ever seen in the modern world. These have now become known as the Susa weddings. Through these, over 10,000 Macedonians and Greeks married Persian brides and women from the newly conquered countries. The idea was that these unions would lead to greater kinship ties between the conquerors and the conquered, and as their children would be ethnically mixed, the process of political, social, cultural and ethnic integration would be rapidly advanced in the space of a generation. Alexander led by example, taking Stateira, a daughter of Darius III, as his second wife, and Parysatis, the youngest daughter of Darius's predecessor, King Artaxerxes III of Persia, as his third wife. Hephaestion married Stateira's sister, Dripetis, and Alexander's other close companions and generals were also made to marry Persian and other foreign women of the conquered territories. Ptolemy, for instance, married Artacama, a daughter of King Artabasos II, the ruler of Phrygia in Anatolia. The Susa weddings were solemnized using Persian marriage rites. Arrian tells us that great gifts were given to each of the grooms as dowries from their new brides, but elsewhere we learn that as soon as Alexander died, the vast majority of the Macedonians and Greeks renounced the wives they had been married to at Susa in 324 BC, indicating a strong level of distaste amongst them for Alexander's methods of cultural integration. The Susa weddings were just one example of what many contemporaries perceived as a worrying trend in Alexander to rule more like an Eastern despot than as a Greek monarch. Ever since the Persian invasions of Greek territory began 2 centuries earlier, the Greeks had defined themselves in opposition to the culture of the Persians. Where the Persians worshipped their rulers like deities and had very little political freedoms, Greeks viewed themselves as a people who were much more individualistic and prioritized their individual liberties even where they lived under monarchs. Greeks and Macedonians, for instance, did not prostrate themselves on the floor before their rulers and kiss the floor like the Persians did when given an audience with their kings, a practice known as proskynesis. In many ways, these ideas of us and them when it comes to political culture have persisted down to the modern world, and European and Western people still view themselves as being different in fundamental opposition to the political cultures of places like Iran, Russia, or China in the East. In Alexander's day, many were consequently concerned by the adoption of Persian rituals at his court at Susa and Babylon and elsewhere in Persia and Mesopotamia, as well as his new tendency to dress like a Persian monarch and his integration of Persian officers and commanders into the Hellenic army. When a mutiny broke out at the town of Opis, near contemporary Baghdad, the mutineers cited Alexander's Oriental habits as one of the causes of the unrest. This growing disillusion with Alexander's methods of ruling after returning from India is important, for the great Macedonian ruler and conqueror was soon dead under somewhat suspicious circumstances. After returning to Babylon and announcing that his army would proceed south to conquer the Arabian Peninsula, he ordered a great banquet to be held in May 323 BC. Not long later, he developed a fever which worsened through the first week of June. Some sources attest that he then lost the ability to speak and eventually died either on the 10th or 11th of June 323 BC in the city of Babylon. Given his untimely demise and the manner in which he fell ill after a banquet in which much wine and food was consumed, theories abounded in ancient times, and have persisted ever since, that Alexander was poisoned. As we saw earlier, Alexander's own father died under suspicious circumstances, and there was a long-standing history of political murders amongst the Macedonian royals. There was also no shortage of reasons why someone might have conspired to kill him. Many were disillusioned at his style of rule, and the manner in which the Indian campaign had ended certainly points towards the army rank and file being unhappy at a potentially new, arduous campaign into the inhospitable Arabian desert. Ultimately, we will probably never know for certain whether Alexander died by chance or foul play in the summer of 323 BC. Alexander's body is understood to have been preserved in honey in a golden sarcophagus and sent back to Macedon, but it was intercepted along the way by Ptolemy, who ordered it to be taken to Egypt, a land where he was beginning to build his own power base. There he is understood to have first been buried at Memphis and later at a tomb in the city of Alexandria, though this version of events remains unsubstantiated and the remains of any such tomb have yet to be identified in modern times. Alexander's death at just 32 years of age created a huge succession crisis in an empire which had only just been built over the previous decade. His wife, Roxana, was pregnant at the time and would soon give birth to King Alexander IV of Macedon, the dead king's only legitimate child, though he may have had at least one illegitimate child born out of wedlock. However, it would be the better part of 20 years before this child would be able to rule in his own right, and such a newly created empire as the one Alexander had built in the 10 years before his death needed strong leadership in order for it not to collapse and revert to the rule of the local elites. Roxana demonstrated her ruthlessness in furthering the cause of her unborn child in quickly ordering the murder of Statira and Parasatis, Alexander's other 2 wives, shortly after their husband's death. Yet there was no agreement on who should serve as regent for the child when he was born, either late in 323 BC or early in 322 BC, or who might succeed Alexander in their own right. Instead, civil war erupted, with many of Alexander's closest companions and generals now trying to carve out their own principalities and kingdoms in various parts of his empire. The wars of the Diadochi, Diadochi being derived from the Greek word for crown princes, would ensue for the next 40 years, with Macedonian generals like Cassander, Perdiccas, Antipater, Ptolemy, and Seleucus, some of whom had been close companions of Alexander, and some of whom rose from relative obscurity in the aftermath of his death, all vying for hegemony. In the end, Alexander's empire would largely end up divided in 3. Cassander established himself as head of the kingdom of Macedon after Alexander's son and heir was assassinated. He and his successors would rule mainland Greece and the islands. Ptolemy founded a dynasty that would rule the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt for nearly 300 years thereafter, with their family also controlling parts of the Levant, Cyprus, and other territories for much of that time. Finally, the largest successor state to Alexander's empire was that claimed by a rather obscure figure, Seleucus. The Seleucid Empire consisted of most of the former lands of the Persian Empire in Asia Minor, the Levant, Mesopotamia, Persia, and east towards Bactria, although most of Alexander's most easterly conquests reverted back to the control of the local powers within a short time after his death. The line died out quickly after his premature death. There is no doubting the significance of his conquests. These allowed for the spread of Greek culture throughout Anatolia, Asia Minor, the Levant, Egypt, and Mesopotamia. The resulting era over the next 3 centuries is known as the Hellenistic period in the Eastern Mediterranean. During it, Greek culture blossomed in the many cities Alexander had ordered the creation of in the lands he conquered. Above all, Alexandria in northern Egypt, as the capital of the Ptolemaic kingdom, became the center of the Greek world, an enormous metropolis that had become the greatest center of learning and knowledge the world had ever seen up to that time. In the 3rd century BC, figures here like Euclid and Eratosthenes made incredible breakthroughs in various scientific fields while studying at the Library of Alexandria, which laid the groundwork for much of the disciplines of geography, mathematics, geometry, astronomy, and arithmetic for centuries to come. Indeed, even centuries later, at the height of the Roman Empire, Alexandria remained the 2nd largest city of the empire and the educational and intellectual capital of it. So successful was the spread of Greek culture around the Eastern Mediterranean and into the Levant following Alexander's conquests that while the Romans might have conquered the successor states of Alexander's empire in the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, the Romans basically absorbed Greek culture, and Roman society was transformed by it over time. Of course, Alexander's legacy was great thereafter. From his own time onwards down to modern times, military commanders and would-be conquerors have always looked up to Alexander as a paragon of military brilliance. The vast Alexander mosaic depicting Alexander charging against King Darius at the Battle of Issus, located in the House of the Faun in Pompeii in southern Italy, has survived sufficiently intact down to the present day to indicate that wealthy Romans had extensive mosaics of Alexander installed in their villas. This one measures nearly 3 meters by more than 5 meters. Julius Caesar idolized Alexander, while his great-nephew, Caesar Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, visited the putative tomb of Alexander while in Egypt. The very fact that the main sources for Alexander's life were written in Roman times attests to the abiding fascination in the Macedon king. In later times, some Muslim writers reworked the tale of Alexander's life to have him visit Mecca, while several medieval and early modern rulers of parts of India adopted the title Sikandar, which is derived from the Persian version of the name Alexander. Perhaps the ruler who most idolized Alexander the Great, though, was Napoleon Bonaparte. His Egyptian expedition, launched in 1798, in which he ultimately planned to march overland through Central Asia to attack British India, was designed in part to emulate Alexander's Persian and Indian campaigns. Alexander the Great was unquestionably one of the most consequential figures in ancient history. For centuries, Macedonia had been a peripheral part of the Greek world, the inhabitants of which were considered little more than barbarians by the more urbane Greeks of cities like Athens. But Macedonia had risen to great heights through the conquests and wars waged by Alexander's father, Philip II, a ruler whose role in these events should not be understated. Building on his father's achievements, Alexander undertook an incredible series of military conquests from the mid-330s BC. For centuries, Mesopotamia and Persia had been the region where powers like the Assyrians, Babylonians, and Persians emanated from to conquer vast parts of the known world. Alexander was the first individual to turn that dynamic on its head, coming east from the Mediterranean to conquer the entire Persian Empire in little more than half a decade. Then he went further, marching onwards with his armies to the edges of the known world in India. One wonders how much further he might have gone had his followers not simply refused to campaign any further east. Though he died not long after, Greek culture was spread extensively to new lands as a result of his actions, and vast parts of Eurasia were changed forevermore. Alexander's reign might not have been peaceful or long, but if rulers acquire the title the Great in response to changing history and the world, then few figures deserve the sobriquet more than Alexander the Great. What do you think of Alexander the Great? Was he an enlightened despot who spread Greek culture far and wide to the Levant, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and beyond in Central Asia? Or was he simply a warlord whose sole objective was conquest and his own aggrandizement? Please, let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.
That the known world had ever seen. It stretched from Macedon in Europe to the Indus Valley in the north of India. He had defeated powerful leaders such as Darius III and King Porus, where he encountered monstrous armies and militaries. Alexander's superior military strength helped the Macedonians conquer Greece, Egypt, and the Persian Empire. Alexander the Great's empire was undoubtedly the greatest power in the known world during the 4th century BC. Alexander's kingdom looked invincible. However, at age 33, Alexander the Great had fallen ill and died in Babylon during 323 BC. He had not named a successor to his throne. Some historians claim that Alexander did not care about a successor, nor the future of his empire, since he wanted to take revenge on the Persians for their campaigns against the Greeks during the 5th century BC. Historians are also divided on Alexander's death, with some claiming that he had caught malaria, suffered from the effects of heavy drinking, or that his immunity was poor, following the death of his best friend Hephaestion. Nevertheless, Alexander's empire had been built for more than 10 years and had no clear successor. The Macedonian generals under Alexander the Great were very uncertain over the future of the empire. Once news broke out about Alexander's death, Athens and Aetolia rebelled against Macedonian rule. This caused the Lamian War of 323 BC. The battle was quashed by Alexander's military commanders, Antipater and Craterus. While this war was suppressed, the Lamian War sent a clear message to the Macedonian rulers. The empire was divided and vulnerable to rebellion and disagreement. Perdiccas, a leading cavalry commander in Alexander's army, believed that it was in the best interest of the empire to wait for Alexander's unborn child to be born. This would mean that the kingdom would have a clear successor. Perdiccas preferred Alexander's wife, Roxanne, and child because it would help him serve as regent for the new king. Despite Perdiccas's ambitions, the empire needed unification and leadership. In 323 BC, Perdiccas brought all of Alexander's commanders together to decide on the next ruler of the empire. Some generals supported Alexander's half-brother, Aridaeus. This gained support from Meleager, another general of Alexander the Great. However, this lacked popularity, so the generals in support of Perdiccas were rewarded parts of Alexander's extensive empire. The most significant distributions were made at the partition of Babylon in 323 BC. Ptolemy received Egypt, Lysimachus took Thrace, Cassander took Macedonia and Greece, and Seleucus took Central Asia. Perdiccas, looking to be diplomatic, had Alexander's ring and his body. He looked to return it to Macedon and Alexander's newly prepared tomb. Perdiccas wanted to bury Alexander back in Macedon. However, Ptolemy, the new ruler of Egypt, had then stolen Alexander's body in Damascus and taken it to Memphis for burial. This was a sign from Ptolemy to the other successors that he wanted to be the next king of Alexander's empire. This triggered the first successor war between Perdiccas and Ptolemy. More arguments over control and power began when Antigonus, one of Alexander's commanders, refused to help Eumenes keep control of his allocated region of Cappadocia. Eumenes was commander of Perdiccas's forces in Asia Minor. However, Antigonus was ordered by Perdiccas to help secure the province for Eumenes. This is because Cappadocia had not been fully subdued under Perdiccas's control. However, Antigonus disobeyed Perdiccas and did not want to seek war, so he retreated with his son, Demetrius Poliorcetes, to Macedon. Antigonus, knowing that Perdiccas would be furious, allied with Antipater, Craterus, Ptolemy, and Lysimachus to combat the alliance of Perdiccas and Eumenes. Perdiccas saw Antigonus's actions as a threat to his authority and sought to humble Antigonus in Macedon. However, the first successful war ended when Perdiccas failed miserably against Ptolemy in Egypt, followed by his death in 320 BC. One thing was certain: Alexander's empire was no longer a cohesive unit and was now a divided kingdom, with rulers that were hungry for power and domination. With the death of Perdiccas, the leaders came to a new agreement at the Treaty of Triparadisus. This saw the condemnation of Eumenes to death and changes to the original partition of Babylon. Antigonus was now the commander of Asia, Ptolemy retained Egypt, Lysimachus retained Thrace, and Seleucus retained Babylon. The first successor war was now over, and Alexander's unified empire was now a series of smaller kingdoms.
I can get perfect music suggestions based off my video, a written.
Picture the moment. A 32-year-old man lies dying in a palace in Babylon. Around his bed stand the greatest generals the ancient world has ever produced. Battle-hardened men who have crossed deserts, climbed mountains, and fought war elephants. And they are weeping. When his soldiers file past to say goodbye, he is too weak to speak. He can only move his eyes to acknowledge each one of them, one by one. Thousands of them, each man who had trusted him with his life. Outside that palace, an empire stretches 4,000 miles, from Greece to the edge of India. He built it in 13 years. He never lost a single battle, and he is 32 years old. His generals lean in and ask the question that will haunt history forever. Who do you leave it to? His answer, whispered with his last breath, was either the most profound thing ever said or the saddest. He said, "To the strongest." This is Alexander the Great. Alexander was born in 356 BCE at Pella in Macedonia, the son of Philip II and Olympias, daughter of King Neoptolemus of Epirus. His father Philip was a military genius who had transformed Macedonia into the most powerful force in Greece. His mother, Olympias, was something else entirely, ferocious, mystical, utterly devoted to her son. She told Alexander from his earliest years that he was descended from Achilles, and that he was not merely a prince. He was touched by the gods. Alexander believed her every single day of his life. From age 13 to 16, he was taught by Aristotle, who inspired him with an interest in philosophy, medicine, and scientific investigation. A teenager tutored by the greatest mind in the ancient world. Raised by a mother who told him he was divine, watching a father conquer Greece battle by battle. The pressure would have crushed most people. For Alexander, it was fuel. Alexander didn't wait for a throne to prove himself. left in charge of Macedonia in 340 BCE during Philip's attack on Byzantium, Alexander defeated the Mede, a Thracian people. He was 16 years old. The boy king was already a soldier. 2 years later came Chaeronea, the battle that gave Macedonia dominance over all of Greece. Alexander commanded the left wing and displayed personal courage in breaking 150 pairs of lovers. The sacred band had never been defeated. Alexander broke them at 18. But triumph turned to turmoil. Philip divorced Olympias, and after a quarrel at a feast held to celebrate his father's new marriage, Alexander and his mother fled. Alexander later going to Illyria. His position as heir was jeopardized. The greatest military dynasty in the ancient world was tearing itself apart. Then came the knife. Philip II, conqueror of Greece, architect of an empire, was assassinated. In 333 BCE, on Philip's assassination, Alexander, acclaimed by the army, succeeded without opposition. He at once executed the princes of Lyncestus, alleged to be behind Philip's murder, and him as their deliverer. At Memphis, Alexander was crowned with the traditional double crown of the pharaohs. He was 23 years old, king of Macedonia, conqueror of Persia, now pharaoh of Egypt. At Gaugamela in 331 BC, weary, adamant, Alexander agreed to take recourse to terror. Brilliant, terrible, unforgettable. As a general, Alexander is among the greatest the world has known, showing unusual versatility in combining different arms and adapting his tactics to enemies commanding novel forms of warfare. Julius Caesar wept at his statue because he had achieved nothing comparable at the same age. Napoleon studied his campaigns obsessively. Every general who came after measured himself against Alexander and fell short. Alexander's career spread Hellenism in a vast colonizing wave throughout the Middle East and created, economically and culturally, a single world stretching from Gibraltar to the Punjab, with the Greek language as a lingua franca. The Roman Empire, the spread of Christianity, and the long centuries of Byzantium were all, in some degree, the fruits of Alexander's achievement. He swallowed the world whole, and it still wasn't enough. He reached the edges of the known earth, wept because there were no more worlds to conquer, and died at 32, still making plans. No one who has ever lived has bent history quite so far, quite so fast, in quite so short a time. The world he made is still the world we live in. Subscribe for more deep dive.
ಇಷ್ಟ ಆಯ್ತಲ್ವಾ? ಇಷ್ಟ ಆಗಿದ್ರೆ ಒಂದು ಲೈಕ್ ಕೊಡಿ, ಶೇರ್ ಮಾಡಿ ಹಾಗೂ ಸಬ್ಸ್ಕ್ರೈಬ್ ಆಗುವುದಂತೂ ಮರಿಲೇಬೇಡಿ. ಎಲ್ಲರಿಗೂ ಧನ್ಯವಾದಗಳು.